So Lingling, who are your favorite Chinese bureaucrats?
Well, I wouldn't say any of them are my favorite. Do I have a choice? I feel like oftentimes I feel like I'm stuck with writing these people. But I often tell Bob, I really envy you because they are so colorful, right? They say things like, off the cuff jokes and comments, however wacky it might sound. But they're human beings, right? They're just human beings.
Not in a million years is a Chinese source going to tell you, oh yeah, we're having Fuck America Week.
Exactly.
Well, hello and welcome to China Talk. This week, Lingling Wei and Bog Davis, both longtime Wall Street Journal veterans, talk about their recent book, Superpower Showdown, an epic TikTok of the U.S.-China trade war. Lingling, mind starting us off with a little bit of personal history?
I was born and grew up in China. I was born in the late 70s into a military family. Both my parents have served in the PLA for most of their lives. My mom was a medical doctor, officer, and my dad also served in the army until Deng Xiaoping decided to downsize the army. So, I grew up in a family where both my parents, they really focused on disciplines and academic achievements and all that. In my family, as soon as I could really remember things, I remembered how proud all my family members always are in terms of my grandfather's connection to Chairman Mao. He basically was with Mao Zedong during the entire Long March, and was sort of like, to my family, he was among the people who helped build a new China. So anyway, I am among the people, the younger generation in China that benefited tremendously from China's reform and opening up. So back in 1999, I got a full scholarship from New York University to basically study journalism at NYU. And I was super excited and everything. And in May of that year, there was this U.S. bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And certainly that was a huge event in this U.S.-China relationship and caused quite anti-American protests in China. And, I remember just day in and day out, the state media, would, play over and over again, those pieces, calling out the American hegemon, just were very, very intense. And obviously, as we wrote in the book, there was lots of suspicion, both in the U.S. too and China. Was that really an accident or that was intentional, right? So nobody in China believed it was really an accident. So, and I also started to doubt, really, should I still go to America when bombers actually, bombed our embassy and killed the Chinese people? So I really questioned myself, and I went to this editor who's a really good mentor and friend. So I asked him, so should I go? Should I still go take the full scholarship and go? Because my interview at the U.S. consulate in Shanghai was literally the next day. So, and then he said, just go. That's the only thing that just go. Just, he said, he didn't say anything else. He just said, just go. It's your future. Just go. That's what I really remembered.
So after enrolling at NYU, you start a career at the Wall Street Journal, worked there for a number of years, get transferred to the Beijing office, and are now, unfortunately, have been remanded back to the U.S. So what do you think the implications for U.S. coverage are now that some of the most longest serving, deeply sourced folks working for major American outlets can no longer go to the mainland?
Sure. It certainly is very unfortunate that so many really experienced American journalists have been kicked out. I really think is a loss for China, not in China's interest at all, because now more than ever, the Chinese should have a lot of reasons to get the outside world to understand what really is going on there much better. We need more windows open, not fewer. And so this kind of tit for tat expulsions of journalists just really is meaningless. It's, this I just don't feel like it's in either country's interest.
So throughout this book, politicians from the US and China have constantly referred to the relationship as some twisted marriage. I particularly was drawn to the most off-color reference by Lou Jiwei, a former finance minister, who said that in the 80s, with regards to trade policy, America treated Japan like a mistress. But now, to the US, China is more like a wife who is more entitled to fight back against a bullying spouse. This sentiment is certainly not 2020 appropriate, but I'm curious if you guys have any potential Chinese or American celebrity marriages that you think capture the essence of the US-China relationship.
Well, for me, one comparison, the current Politburo Standing Committee member, Wang Yang, made was to the marriage between Rupert Murdoch and Wendy Deng, right? That was in our book. They talked about that, basically, just how that marriage fell apart. But then he basically made a comment that, when it comes to the U.S.-China marriage, they're not going to get divorced because it's just way too expensive, even more expensive than the other marriage, the real life marriage, and turning into divorce. So that's the one, reference one of the top Chinese leaders made.
Sure. So, of all the people to be hanging out with the world, the Trump White House and the Xi administration do not particularly sound like the most fun folks. So I want to congratulate you guys on this yeoman's work of developing the sources and sharing this narrative for everyone. But I'm curious if you maybe could share a few character sketches of the folks who you felt had the most outstanding personalities.
So, of all the people to be hanging out with in the world, the Trump White House and Xi administration do not particularly sound like the most fun folks to be spending a lot of time with. So I first off just want to congratulate you guys on yeoman's work of developing these sources and sharing this narrative. I'm curious, though, if you guys could share a few character sketches of the folks you think had the most outstanding personalities in this cohort.
On the American side, it is quite a cast of characters. The one who almost no one likes is Peter Navarro, the trade advisor, a guy who was an academic in California, had, it was a reputable academic, was a Harvard PhD. He was an expert in utility regulation, turned himself into China, not a China scholar. I would kind of call him a China pamphleteer. He looked at pretty much everything, every bad thing you can possibly think about China, many of them which are true, and then package them into any number of books with names like Death from China, The Coming China Wars.
Did he insult dumplings at some point?
Insult dumplings? How could anyone insult dumplings?
Food about spicy food was bad. I don't even know. It's not even worth it. Never mind.
He might have. Who knows with him? But he was sort of in some ways he was a kind of Washington character. At his heart. He was sort of an academic on the make. He tried to get elected, ran for mayor, ran for Congress, on Democratic Party, Republican Party, came close. He actually came close a couple of times and had a reputation as an anti-urban development environmentalist of all things. But then he morphed into this, conservative anti-China personality, and the Trump team, which had no academic support, grabbed onto him. He was a PhD academic, after all, a PhD economist from Harvard, no less. So he gets into the White House, and then he is immediately frozen out by people who you feel will be far, far more effective in dealing with the president than he would be. People like Gary Cohn, who was the president of Goldman Sachs, Steve Mnuchin, who was another, very senior person at Goldman Sachs, people who had spent their lives figuring out how to climb bureaucracies and had done it well and were powerful personalities. There was one time where Navarro, being frozen out from the White House from the Oval Office for 50 days, wanders through the old executive office building where he has his office, which is across from the White House, saying, it's like fucking Game of Thrones around here. and you just could feel. I felt bad for the guy, actually. I mean, I thought he was pugnacious, swimming against the tide. Forget about sort of the policies and all that. But then, over time, Trump relies on him more and more, not so much for policy support, because he really didn't have that kind of sway, but more for almost moral support. I mean, I want to take a tough stand on China, and Peter Navarro is the guy I'm going to go to. Now, that contrasts with another one who's very hawkish on China, the trade representative, Bob Lighthizer, who, when he first met Trump looked at him as just, a trade lawyer, very stiff, didn't like the guy, couldn't remember his name, whether it was Lighthizer or Lightheimer or whatever. But Lighthizer was a guy who was an avowed protectionist. That's what he had written op-eds about it, including one supporting Trump during an earlier presidential run. The two didn't know each other. And he was kind of the perfect trade representative for a guy like Donald Trump, because he was a protectionist. He did have China in his sights his whole career, but he understood how to use the levers of government. He understood the law. He understood, acting within the law, making the procedural steps, or taking the procedural steps you needed to win lawsuits. And if you kind of compare the administration on trade to the administration on immigration, two of its biggest priorities, I mean, they got reversed time after time after time on immigration, and they've never been reversed on trade. So what you had was Navarro as kind of, the emotion, the id, I suppose, and then Lighthizer as the one who actually, the effective one, who could get to Trump and convince him to take the steps that both of them wanted him to take.
So, Lingling, who are your favorite Chinese bureaucrats?
Well, I wouldn't say any of them are my favorite. Do I have a choice? I have a choice. I feel like oftentimes I feel like I'm stuck with writing these people. But I often tell Bob, I really envy you, because they are so colorful, right? They say things like, off the cuff jokes and comments, and just, wow, that just, yes, however wacky it might sound, but they're human beings, right?
Yeah.
They're just human beings.
Not in a million years is a Chinese source going to tell you, oh yeah, we're having Fuck America Week.
That's true.
Exactly.
Well, what about Lingling? What about Lo Jiwei? He's like a piece of work, kind of.
He's a piece of work. So when I heard about that marriage, the wife versus mistress, that comment, Jordan, you referred to earlier, I was like, oh my God, we have to write about this. It in itself is a great story to show at least, some Chinese official still, can, however politically incorrect that might be, still, speaks his mind, right? Not always towing the party line. But anyway, obviously for the Chinese side, I really try to, focus on the very top, because as you know, that Xi Jinping has so much power. He's the one who calls the shot. So we really spend most of the emphasis on him, and also on Liu He. He's basically right-hand man when it comes to economic matters. So we really try to explain what kind of person he is, and how his years of experiences, all the way back to his childhood. He's spending years in a village feeding pigs and doing other kind of manual labor. How all those experiences have shaped him, both as a person and as a leader. He never ever really, drifted away from being a loyal party member, right? He didn't see the contradiction between, continued liberalization and consolidation power, emphasizing party control, because he thinks that, there's no contradiction there. His predecessors have done that, and he thinks he can do that as well. In terms of Liu He, obviously, he's a very well-liked figure, both in China and overseas, especially in the U.S. People in the U.S. feel like he speaks very good English, very humble, modest, hardworking, professional, all those good qualities. A lot of Americans are looking forward to. But on the other hand, he's nothing like zhu rongji, right? He doesn't have this political chops or political bureaucratic cunning to really push through really painful changes that the Chinese economy badly needs, or the U.S. side has been demanding all along. So we just really try to, on the Chinese side, the most of the emphasis in terms of characters, personalities, we really try to focus is true. And obviously, we talk a little bit about what kind of people worked for Liu He. Part of his team is this guy Liao Ming, right? He's also one of the more westernized officials in China, and also unlike any of the bureaucrats that we commonly know, he actually has some kind of personality, and he's quite a character. He likes to write down songs, and actually is quite a good singer. So when he was named as a key member to Liu He's negotiation team, the online community in China called him the folk song singer. So it's just we try to just here and there just try to give a fuller picture of what the Chinese team is like. But of course, the most emphasis is on Xi and Liu.
What's interesting, Lingling, is actually these guys' personal histories are much more interesting than the Trump team. I mean, the psychodrama of your parents getting purged, and we were talking about Liao Min. He was on Peking University campus from 1986 to 1993. And I can't imagine folk singers were the big right-wing clique on campus. And so whatever is going on in these folks' heads to lead them to the positions they are today is these memoirs will never be written in a way that will, satisfy our curiosities, but just sort of hypothesizing about what seeing all this trauma over the preceding decades does for these leaders now is an interesting thing to ponder.
Yeah,
sure, it's fascinating, endlessly fascinating.
And
sure.
as you point out, I hadn't really thought about this. If he was on campus in those years, it would have been during
his
Tiananmen.
Friends died. His friends were killed completely.
Yeah.
It's the history is very real with this entire generation of leadership in a way that it is completely not to anyone but, what was it? Hank Paulson got the shout out for having stormed the beaches of Normandy, but basically
Hank Greenberg.
Yes, Hank Greenberg.
I always think that there is a psychological reckoning that will come at some point in China for all the sort of horrible things that generations went through. I mean, to me, it's not all that different from people who had gone through the Holocaust and survived, right? I mean, they were closed up about it for years and years and years, and at some point it comes out. I mean, like Lingling's family is just, to me, the story of modern China. I mean, they've been through the Cultural Revolution. They've been through the great leap forward. I mean, and her family isn't unusual remotely, right? I mean, they've all been through it. It's just within a 2-generation, time span, just these amazingly, traumatic events.
Yeah, it's important to remember every single one of these characters who lived through the 60s went hungry. It's sort of hard to, no one in the Trump White House has had any personal challenge of that pale, nothing that remotely pales to what the Chinese side has gone through over the course of their lives, and the values that they've imbued from their parents, who've seen even more and have been even more directly infected by the tribulations of the Mao years.
Right, and that's the one thing, if you talk to Chinese officials, they would often remind you of, like the Chinese people and their leaders have been through so much. It's like, nothing we haven't experienced before. When they talk about current situation, they said, okay, so be it. If you really, I mean, at least that's an official line. If you really, cut the ties completely and crack down China completely, we can just, fasten our seatbelt or, tighten our purse strings, eat bitterness. So we're very good at eating bitterness. But obviously the reality today, in today's China, is fundamentally different from that era. You do have hugely changing population, their needs and their demands have also changed dramatically. You just can't draw that simple comparison anymore.
Sure. So let's talk about Xi's economic ideology. At one point, I remember I was working at Eurasia Group and all the China analysts got excited when he said that the market should play a decisive role. But it has been a long time since then. So, there is a level at which he appreciates markets, but there is a deeper level at which he appreciates state-owned enterprises. Talk a little bit about how his past experiences in Shanghai and Fujian informed this view, and how his thought with regards to the role market should play in China's economy has played out over the course of his time in leadership.
Sure. Upon rising to power in late 2012, Xi Jinping's plan basically was really, at that point, he was to continue Deng Xiaoping's policy and advance it, basically, because under Deng Xiaoping and the leaders after him, China did liberalize the economy step by step. And for Xi, it was a natural continuation of that policy. So during that, I think was in 2013, when they issued that big economic blueprint, the wording had changed from market forces playing an important role, to a decisive role. So they just really thought that was a continuation of Deng's policy. But he's obviously Xi's early experience of running some of the wealthiest regions in China, including Fujian, Zhejiang, Shanghai, helped shape his views, help him gain certain kind of respect for market forces. So that definitely played a big part into why the way he phrased the term at the time. But obviously for him, the top priority is maintain stability and strengthening the party's rule of China. So when that effort to expand market influence in China's economy kind of runs counter to the top overarching agenda of strengthening party's control over the country, when those two things contradict, obviously he would pick the latter. And the market crashes in 2015 and in early 2016 really spooked him. So that was really a period of time when he thought, okay, market was dangerous, was very risky. And it was a time when the state actually helped rescue the investors and the like. So that really was a turning point in how he views the market forces, and why there was such a 180-degree turn later on, in terms of reforms.
This show took me 10 hours of reading, 2 hours of script writing, an hour of recording, and 4 hours of editing to produce. Right now, I receive $50 in donations per show, meaning my work on this podcast averages out to making $3 an hour. As much as I love making China Talk, I'm coming up on the 100th episode, and I've been reflecting on how much time I put into the podcast, and it's getting harder for me to justify spending so much time on something that brings in so little financially. If you have the means, please consider supporting the show. Links are in the show notes. Let's talk a little bit about Xi's relationship to America and how it's evolved over time.
Right. She definitely, I don't know what's happening now, but up until recently, up until we finished the book, we definitely could have said definitively he returned certain, the respect and affection for the Americans. He named his chief agenda for China Dream, right?
Sure.
It has ring of American Dream. And when he met with, I think it was President Obama, during their last summit together, she said that there's 1,000 reasons to have a good U.S.-China relationship, not a single reason to spoil it. That's the line he has repeated over and over again, even with President Trump. So obviously he did set out to try to have a good relationship with the U.S. But obviously, in the end, it's the actions that speak louder. The fact that China has become increasingly assertive and aggressive on all those issues certainly, made the U.S. more alert of the wary of China's rights.
So she made a speech at Davos, which I think is a fascinating kind of moment of political theater, where he tries to sort of take upon the mantle of globalization, very much in contrast to the line that the Trump administration was staking out. Paint a scene a little bit about what this speech was and what it represented at the time.
So, this is the beginning of the Trump administration, right? Trump had campaigned on America First, talking about an isolationist, protectionist administration. He delivered a lot on that kind of talk. And so for Xi Jinping, this was a moment where he goes to Davos. So you go in there, and for Xi Jinping, this is a great opportunity to talk about his devotion to globalization and to the power of global interchange and global trade. And he gets a standing ovation because he's seen as, someone standing up for global integration, which everyone in Davos agrees with, and he's not Donald Trump.
I remember, his speech actually was it was a good speech, I have to say, that, it was unlike reading the official documents coming out of China, all those really formulaic kind of remarks by Chinese officials is carried by the state-owned media. That speech was quite effective. And, I remember he even quoted Lincoln's Gettysburg speech. So in that speech, obviously they really tried hard to get his message across to a more global and elite audience.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I have a hypothesis that they found some PR person, or maybe there's just some young person who spent a lot of time in the West who was involved with this. But it
they're full of people. They're full of people. No, yeah,
totally. But it was the one time where he really sounded like he was a Western politician giving a speech, which is not what 99% of the the internal party speeches or whatever that end up getting posted later sound like. As you mentioned, at one point he kind of needled the U.S. about how development should be of the people, by the people, and for
exactly.
the people. Exactly. It's funny because the Americans do this too. They have someone who took their early Chinese classical thought courses, and Lighthizer had like some Confucius reference. Pottinger quotes Lu Xun every once in a while.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Here's a question for you two guys: who do you think has more respect for their supposed intellectual grandfathers, the Trump administration towards Lincoln or Xi towards Kongzi?
The Trump administration has no intellectual roots to Lincoln. Let's just end it right there.
I would agree with Bob, but in China, definitely, I think on the surface, of course, there's an effort to really get younger generation to know more about the Chinese culture, the traditional Chinese culture. These days, when I lived in Beijing, I saw so many of my friends actually hiring like traditional Chinese tutors for their children. So it's definitely you sense that happening, but at the same time, Xi's rule of China has been marked by this remarkable renewed emphasis on making the party the center of every aspect of the Chinese society, which includes the Chinese education, the cultural aspect of things. So yeah, they often talk about the need to respect the traditions and all that, but the caveat always has been, of course, we learn about what the past was based on what the party's interpretation is.
It's funny, Lingling, because I walked by a lot of those little like classical schools for children that have they have like the nice like ancient looking doorways, and I walked into one or two of them and I was like, hey, like, can you guys teach me? And they just were so confused that like a 29-year-old white man was wanting to hang out with 10-year-olds and recite Confucius and learn how to paint classical landscapes or whatever, that they all very politely turned me away. Well, anyways, one of the tactics of Xi's administration is to have these sort of old friend sessions where senior Chinese officials will have conversations with folks who've been doing business for a long time in China and, try to work them, basically. Describe the relationship between the senior Chinese officials and the leading lights of business and, former administration officials they keep in touch with.
Right. So you mentioned those old friend sessions Wang Qishan frequently has with American business leaders that he had known for years. He doesn't have a specific portfolio for now, but he's influential with President Xi Jinping because, they go way back. He's also instrumental in terms of helping Xi launch this unprecedented anti-corruption campaign. So he definitely has the ears of Xi Jinping. So he sees himself as an advisor to him. So through those old friend sessions, he tried to, get more better understanding, more information about the Trump administration. So, and then pass along to the top leadership and help them form is basically for foreign policy American, how to deal with the American side.
It's interesting, the relationship of big business and some of the more famous CEOs and their ability to influence this administration. So on plenty of things, on tax policy, on deregulation, big business has an enormous role in this administration. I mean, it is an administration that has appointed lobbyists to head cabinet agencies. But on trade, it's very different. Trade is an area where Donald Trump from the start knew his own head, wasn't really interested in talking very much on trade policy to these same people. He would listen to them when it came to, how the market was doing, which he cared about enormously. But I would say, for people like Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone or John Thornton, who used to be at Goldman Sachs, or some of the casino owners, Sheldon Adelson, and people of that sort who have lots of contacts in Beijing, they would largely operate as kind of messengers. They would get intelligence from the one and so on of the world, or Liu He's of the world, and relay it back to Washington. They would take messages from Washington and relay it to China. They tried to keep things from spinning out of control too badly, but their influence in terms of getting the administration to change course on the fundamentals, on using tariffs as a weapon, as pushing China further and further, was actually quite limited.
Could you talk about the dichotomy you lay out as Trump as both hawk and dove, as well as blue-collar Trump versus Wall Street Trump?
Trump is a more complicated character than he sometimes looks. So he's a guy who basically made his reputation as more than a real estate developer by working on or talking about international trade. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, it was Japan. They're ripping us off. The leaders are playing you for fools. It's exactly the same arguments he would make about China. But, repeating the same thing for 30 years gives you a certain sense of that you know what you're talking about. And then, so he comes into office talking enormously about China. China's one of the big planks. Again, the same pitch that, it's an anti-elitist pitch. The Chinese have ripped you off and your leaders have let you down. And that was one of the fairness, basically a symbolism of fairness and elitism that the campaign capitalized on. So he comes in and he really isn't ready to take on China, not remotely. I mean, the first year they did almost nothing on China, and they focused in Asia, the focus was on North Korea. So there's two kind of Donald Trumps, when it comes to trade. On the one hand, there is what we call blue-collar Trump. Everything I just said, the Chinese are ripping you off. He believes that. I mean, that is part of what he thinks about. But then there's also another part of him that looks obsessively at the way the stock market operates. As somebody who grew up in Queens, and whose stepmother knew Donald Trump as a young boy, I look at the president as another guy from Queens, like I grew up with. I mean, it's very much in that way. And so the easiest way to predict when he would back off on some, China offensive would be if the markets were reacting. That was the simplest way. Otherwise, he's very unpredictable. So he ping pongs between, blue collar Trump and Wall Street Trump, and his different aides play on these kind of two personalities. So people like Navarro or Lighthizer will work on the, when he's in the Wall Street and when he's in the blue collar Trump. And then he has people like Steve Mnuchin who will, China's a problem. Certainly it's a problem, or any NEC director. But there are a lot of problems in the global economy, and we can't really let this get out of control. And they play to that side of his personality. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons you'd see U.S. policy ping pong back and forth, making it very hard for the Chinese to understand and very hard for people in the U.S. to understand as well.
Not many folks in the Chinese intelligence services grew up in Queens. Ling, you write about how sort of befuddled the Chinese bureaucracy was with Trump, and how, they actually, one of their tactics to understand what was going on in the administration was to call up, Steve Wynn and Stephen Schwartzman. Trump is a confusing character for sure, but what else do you think made it so difficult for the Xi administration to wrap their heads around what was going on in the U.S.?
I think there's so much hubris in China these days as well. So it also took a very long time for the Chinese side to realize that the old ways of doing things, the old ways of trying to basically tie your components up in endless dialogues and conversations, just not going to work anymore. And even to this day, you talk to Chinese officials, they still would say something like, yes, we know that you want actions right now, but before we take any actions, we still need to sit down and talk. And the Trump administration would respond, I'm done talking. We've been talking for decades now, and still no solution. You're not taking actions. So I think that's just, that kind of the dynamic is still happening today. And, they constantly talk past each other on issues. It's just pretty amazing to watch. I think obviously, yes, the Trump administration, especially during the 2 years of trade war, was very confusing to the Chinese side. And then especially initially, the Chinese side would complain, we didn't know who was in charge, right? Was it Wilbur Ross? Was it someone else? The funnest story and the part that I was really proud of was, what Bob and I describe in the book, one during Trump's visit to Beijing, both sides, had an economic, meeting, just focused on economic issues. So it was a meeting with President Xi Jinping, right? And the other side was led by President Trump. And the Chinese sides were all expecting lead economic official on the Trump team would be Wilbur Ross. And instead, it was Lighthizer basically standing up, gave Xi Jinping a lecture about all the things China has done wrong. Where was Wilbur Ross? He was outside of the meeting room in the Great Hall of the People, waiting to be consulted. That was just one of the funnest stories I think we got in terms of illustrating the Chinese confusion. What the heck, So, but later on, I do feel like they knew who was in charge. It was very clear. It was Trump and Lighthizer, right? But they still tried to play that card, like the confusion. Oh, we didn't know what exactly you want. Of course they know what exactly the U.S. side wants. There is a list.
Yeah, no, I agree with that totally. They were afraid of Lighthizer. They didn't like Lighthizer. They tried to go around him, and it was a mistake on their part.
Because he knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing. He knew what he studied. He had this plan, agree with it, disagree with it, but he had a plan. But he was a tough guy, and they saw the Treasury Secretary as, more malleable. Treasury in general has, a view of open markets and keeping the financial markets strong. And they had dealt with, Hank Paulson as the Treasury Secretary. They had dealt with Tim Geithner, both of whom had deep understanding and experience with China. and they were looking for, his replacement.
Yeah. I mean, I think the model of like New York City liberal Jewish financier is something that senior Chinese officialdom understands pretty well.
Yeah.
But all these new breeds of the Robert Navarros and the Donald Trumps of the world, and even like a Lighthizer type, they haven't had to deal with in a very, very long time.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, no, I mean, Lighthizer, even within the trade bar in Washington, he was a guy who represented the steel industry, U.S. Steel. He got rich representing U.S. Steel in dumping actions on steel cases. And one trade person said to me that defending steel companies on dumping is like being in the Galapagos when it comes to, the trade bar. It's just out there. It has nothing to do with anything else.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of folks, they are, excited to negotiate, to argue things in front of the WTO court and like want to be judges one day maybe on it. And this guy has really, you have a great line where at some point he gave a congressional testimony in 2012, basically laying out a protectionist trade policy. And he thought of it as his sort of valedictory of like, I'm going to retire into the sunset because there's never going to be a president that's going to want me to implement these sort of actions of reviving these trade laws from the 1970s and throwing tariffs on Canadian steel and what have you. But he really hit the jackpot with Donald Trump.
Yeah, no doubt.
So going back to the Americans and their adventures in Beijing, great moment, which I can't pass up, which is when Robert Navarro takes Steve Mnuchin out into the courtyard or whatever. He gives you this absolutely outrageous quote where he says, you guys quote him presumably indirectly, Navarro assumed that they were far enough from any building that the Chinese bugged so he's thinking like, oh, they're not going to catch me doing this. And then he screams at Mnuchin for 20 minutes. I mean, I remember you guys reported this like the day after, right? It's just a clown show. It's just unbelievable.
You guys are probably not going to tell me the answer to this, but the source of that story, there are three potential options, all of which are hysterical. So one is Navarro somehow thinking this would make him sound tough. Two is Mnuchin trying to embarrass Navarro, but is really just incredibly embarrassing for everyone. And three, which would really be the best, is if there was a Chinese official who caught wind of this and just had to share the juicy gossip with Lingling. So I don't know if you guys want to nod twice as to which one it was, but all three are just too outrageous.
Well, I'll give you one hint. There were multiple sources on both sides. Put it that way. It was, yeah. I mean, the Chinese were like, "What the fuck's going on?" And and on the American side, actually the same, the same response. Yeah, no, I mean, Navarro went after him. There was a buildup here too. Remember that, as I said, that Navarro had been frozen out, and Gary Cohn, who was at that time the NEC director, National Economic Council director, had tried to freeze him out. Was pretty effective, but also Mnuchin and Cohn had tried to get him, shipped to the basement, literally to the basement of the Commerce Department, and Steve Bannon, rescued him. So he felt talked down to by Mnuchin. He was talked down to by Mnuchin. It's not just felt. And so, all that, exploded in him. And also he's just a volatile character. He's got quite a temper and, and felt demeaned. So, but still, it was unbelievable.
So back in the 90s in the negotiation over the WTO, there was this dynamic within the Chinese government where Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji were trying to use the trade negotiations as a way to force the broader Chinese economy to liberalize and as a lever in which to reduce the power and influence of the SOEs. It seems like the Chinese side, particularly Liu He, tried to use this mental model that Americans have of the way Chinese do negotiation sessions to persuade the Americans that, this is what really they were pushing to. At one point, you guys have a quote that Lighthizer had come to trust and respect Liu as a committed reformer. You also have an anonymous Chinese source talking about how, quote, the Americans failed to realize just how hard it had been to create a bureaucratic consensus and to get to where we were before they decided to throw it all away. They also said to you guys at one point that the Americans are very, very tough negotiators. Yeah. But my question to you guys is, at what
to what extent does this model really make sense? My reading of the situation in the 90s is that the big difference was the fact that the president was down with the program and wanted and was actually saw the trade negotiations as something that should be pursued and really embraced, and was willing to put the political capital behind Zhu Rongji in order to allow him to make these tough concessions. So I'm curious, to what extent are the Chinese bureaucrats really just playing the Americans here and trying to get off a little easier in the trade war, when Xi, in fact, doesn't really have much desire to implement the sorts of reforms which, ironically, may be of more benefit to the Chinese economy than the sort of more statist path that he is currently pursuing?
Right. That was a great question. Very observing on your part. We definitely try to do a compare and contrast between back in the late 90s when China was trying to negotiate to get into WTO versus the most recent round of negotiations when China was trying to fend off this trade offensive from the Trump administration. You're exactly right. Back in the Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji era, so that at that time the top political agenda, was very fixated on continuing the reform and liberalization of the Chinese economy. We talked about the 99 U.S. bombing of Chinese embassy earlier. So even in that kind of circumstances, Jiang Zemin famously said that let's not deviate from our core focus of trying to, liberalize the Chinese economy. So I remember we talked about the day in, day out, this propaganda attacks on the U.S., but that only lasted for a few weeks. Immediately, the tone changed after Jiang Zemin spoke, had a higher level policy meeting. So he was able to really stick to what he wanted to achieve and give Zhu Rongji the flexibility and the room to do the negotiations. And this time around, it's no longer the case. In years past, foreign pressure was good for reforms in China, not anymore under Xi Jinping, because first of all, the leadership changed, and then the top agenda also has changed. Today's top agenda for China is this so-called China dream, right? It really means having a strong, unified China that can compete with the U.S. economically, technologically, and politically. And that also means the country wholeheartedly adheres to this one-party system. So yes, you're right to point out that many things the American side has asked for really is in the long-term interest of the Chinese economy, but not necessarily in the long-term interest of the party, right? So when those things contradict with each other, what the top leadership would choose. At the very outside of negotiations, Xi Jinping already drew the lines in terms of things that we can negotiate and make concessions to, and there's things that are off limits.
Another one of the lines that stuck out at me was, you said that both sides had to worry about critics back home, accusing them of weakness. And it sort of reminds me of this reference. I think it was in a Stephen Kotkin book, talking about when Stalin was saying to FDR at Yalta or something that he had domestic constituencies to please too, and he couldn't, necessarily give in on everything, which I felt was a little bit maybe overstating the case on the amount of latitude that she has to go whichever direction he chooses.
I mean, that's often the reason Chinese officials would give you to explain why Xi Jinping has removed term limits, why he has consolidated power so much, is because he wanted to do things, and then only with more power in his hand could he neutralize the vested interests, the opponents in terms of to carry out things he really wanted to do. But so far, yes, we have seen this consolidation power happening, but we really haven't seen reform happening.
Yeah, I mean, that narrative you just put forward, Lingling, really sounds like the backstory to some Marvel supervillain. But anyways, anything on this, Bob?
No, I think the only thing I would add on the whole reformer sort of thing is I think the U.S. has been searching for another Juronji since '99, and they keep thinking they find one. They keep talking about these Chinese reformer, who will understand that it's the things that the U.S. asks for are actually in China's interest, and there just isn't anybody like Juronji at this point, right? I mean, who has the vision in terms of the economic reforms and the political skills to get it through the bureaucracy and the support of the Communist Party leader. I mean, it just isn't anybody like that.
Lingling, how different would China look today if Li Keqiang was at the top?
Well, I maybe not as belligerent, this wolf warrior diplomacy. I mean, it's always there, right? It's always part of the party leadership's playbook when it comes to foreign forces, especially American hegemon. Chairman Mao used it back in the 50s, the 60s, over and over again, especially when China has some domestic issues, they would play this, return to this old playbook. Li Keqiang, he obviously, we talk about leadership styles, right? Li Keqiang's style, much different from Xi Jinping. People could talk back to him. You know what I mean? The one famous anecdote I heard was during one of the high-level economic meetings Li Keqiang presided over. That was in the first term of Xi Jinping. Lou Jiwei, Li Keqiang was talking about certain ways to fix the fiscal problems, and Lou Jiwei just cut him off, said, "Oh, what do you say was wrong?" Things like that. But things felt, people felt like, they could talk back to him, but not with Xi Jinping. Right. Yeah. So that
he would never have become a 伟大的领袖. Right?
No,
I mean, it's just not his style.
No, not his style. And during the COVID pandemic, right? So you know that Xi Jinping named him actually the head of this one leading group in charge of fighting COVID. And there are so many leading groups in China. Li Keqiang was never head. So when it comes to fighting COVID, he was finally named as head. So it's a kind of thankless job, at least in the beginning. So she sent him to Wuhan, paying a visit to the flea market in Wuhan, and people just really yelled back at him. And when he asked the ordinary residents in Wuhan, how are you guys doing? Are you okay? Doing okay? And the one guy just shouted back, "Are we doing okay? Are you kidding me?" It's like, it's like people, yes, he's very senior, he's top, but people not as intimidated by him. So just that speaks a little bit about his leadership style. So you can speculate if he were the top, maybe China wouldn't engage in this so much as this eye for eye, tit for tat, that kind of strategy. But it's really hard to say. I mean, really, really hard to say. It really depends on what position you're in. When you're number one,
sure.
Obviously you might do things differently as when you're number two or number three.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't put two and two together, but of course Trump at one point delegated all of this to Mike Pence, which is a funny little parallel about how both leaders thought that they could, pass the blame, and if it didn't go well, it would be the number two's fault. Last question for you, Lingling. Just in your description of Li Keqiang, folks always do hypotheticals about what if the transition would have looked different in 2012 and a different person would have come up. Based on the kind of personality that Li has shown over the past few years, if you run history 100 times, are there many instances in which she doesn't come out as president?
That's not guaranteed at all. Back then, I would say the biggest wild card actually was Bo Xilai. Yeah. He famously said, there cannot be two tigers in a mountain, right? So even if the top leaders decided it was Xi's turn to have the country, if Bo, didn't get purged, still returned some kind of senior role in the government, he would stir up a lot of problems for him, right? I'm not talking, I can't speculate on outright coup or any sorts, but there will be a lot more problems that would make she felt very, very insecure.
Yeah, and he doesn't have to look over his shoulder at the likes of anyone else on the standing committee.
Well, for the first 2 years, he did, right? That explained why the anti-corruption campaign and the military shakeup, right? Because any number of people would take him down because he was he really didn't have that kind of legitimacy Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao had. So he had to consolidate power. He had to bring down his rivals to secure his position.
Bob and Lingling, thanks so much for coming on China Talk.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invite.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I really had fun.
So for this week's outro track, I actually found one of those old folk songs from the PKU grad student turned government official.
心跳的亲切和淡淡的忧愁，你是否还有愤青的思绪，冲动的遐想和不败的所求？年少的他呀，年轻的他呀，还在一年一年的为爱沉醉着，而你恐怕已不敢再回爱过的年代变得遥远陌生了吧？你是否常回梦中的草坪，为歌而动心，为轻狂而哭泣？你是否记得拥挤的宿舍，彻夜的卧蚕和窗外的月光？夏天的水莲，冬天的飘雪，还在一季一季的轮回绽放着，而你恐怕已搬迁这世事随波而逐流，飘得无影无踪了吧？啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦。啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦。啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦。啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦啦。
他有男朋友，我就问他，那你为什么还要让我给你打这水呢？他说是为了让他的男朋友休息一下。尽管他一次次的拒绝我，但我还是想每天都看到他，因为他是我的梦想。梦想是什么？梦想就是一种让你感到坚持，这是幸福的东西。
现在的你是原来想象的、希望的、渴望的那样快乐吗？想象、希望的、渴望快乐，没有常在逝去的生命的过程中稍作停留和回首。逝去的生命停留和回首，心里的目标，美丽的东西是越来越清晰或越来越模糊。清晰与模糊，得到的全部，失去的所有，走过的水，越长的如梦如幻了吧？是落日初中，风霜雪雨下，不变的期盼和永远的守候。爱人的眼神，孩儿的血步，斑驳的映照在阳光绿荫下。能够拥有的，不能了解的，还在一点一滴的随风摇曳着。缓缓的脚步，暂时的拥有，流动的青春 春，来吧去吧和飞吧。缓缓的脚步，真实的拥有流动的青春，来吧去吧和飞吧。